In this video, we're going to break down Luther Burden III out of Mizzou. What are his strengths and weaknesses? How is he best utilized? And where do we think he fits in this class and amongst the 2024 class? Watch to the end of this video and you'll have a good idea. Burden is 5'11", 208 pounds. I think that's reasonably accurate. I don't think during the combine when we get the measurables, we're going to see too much of a difference there. And he's a relatively young prospect as well, so we like that. He's only 21 years and 1 month old right now, and so that means for the entirety of his rookie season, he is going to be 21. Now, when we take a look at his production, it doesn't quite match that of Ted McMillan's, but Burden's also in the SEC, and so his competition is going to be a little bit more difficult in general. When we take a look at his production, 75 targets, 46 receptions, 398 yards, and 6 touchdowns, with a PFF receiving grade of 64.7. Those numbers are really, really good for a true freshman. Remember that Malik Neighbors, for instance, had a little bit north of 400 yards as a true freshman. And so, considering he had 6 touchdowns, that's thoroughly impressive. But then look at the leap from his freshman season to his sophomore season. He went from 75 targets to 120, 46 receptions up to 86, 398 yards up to 1,209, and 6 touchdowns up to 9, along with his PFF receiving grade going from 64.7 up to 91. He was a truly dominant player, and in a lot of draft boards, he was projected to be the wide receiver 1, split between him and Ted McMillan. Now, when you take a look at his sophomore season compared to his junior season, you might notice that the numbers all go quite a bit down. He went from 120 targets down to 80, 86 receptions down back to 61, 1,209 yards down to 676, and 96 touchdowns, along with his PFF receiving grade going from 91 down to 80.2. I will say, I do think he looked a little bit better as a sophomore, but I think the environment is going to be a huge factor here, and the regression of Brady Cook is going to be a huge reason why his total stat line didn't look quite as good this season. Getting into some of his 2024 advanced stats, I looked at draft-eligible FBS wide receivers with 75-plus targets. Once again, that was a sample size of 84, just like with Ted McMillan. Burden III ran 292 routes this season, which was 95.4% of the team routes. So we like the total involvement here. Looking at his utilization, you'll notice 85.3% of the time he's in the slot this season and 11.8% of the time out wide. And so, generally, he is a slot receiver. In terms of how he was actually utilized, I'll get to in a little bit later how effective I think he could be on the outside as an X or a Z. But for what it's worth, he was generally a slot receiver in college, especially during his sophomore and junior season. He was a little bit more outside as a freshman. In terms of his yards per out run, his 2.32 this season were tied for 31st. Not particularly great. His PFF receiving grade of 80.2 is 21st. Not that amazing either, but fine. His yak per reception of 6.1 was 28th. And so that might not sound that impressive, but he's really good after the catch. And his 29 missed tackles forced, which was tied for first among all these wide receivers, should tell you that. In terms of his contested catch percentage, he had a 54.5% this season, which was 6 out of 11 targets. I will say, in both 2023 and 2024, he had over a 50% contested catch rate. And so he is very good in contested catch situations. Looking at his targets, his 80 were tied for 66th, not great. His 31 receptions were tied for 38th, not fantastic. His 676 yards were 70th, yikes, and his 6 touchdowns were tied for 37th. And so a lot of these stats suggest that he really wasn't quite as effective this season, but I don't think that these paint a full picture as to how good he actually is, besides the missed tackles forced. So if you look, he was 26.67% of his team's total passing yards, and so that's not quite a third, but that's over a quarter of them. But he was also 54.55% of his team's touchdowns. And so I think that paints a better picture than just looking at the counting stats. Their quarterback only passed for a little bit north of 2,500 yards. And so it's going to be pretty hard to have a ridiculous season if your passing offense is just completely anemic. And so I also wanted to take a look at 2023 to show you how impressive he was as a true sophomore. So among draft-eligible wide receivers in the FBS with 75-plus targets, that was a total of 61 in the sample size. Burden III ran 367 routes, which was 94.8% of his team routes. Not quite as much as he had this season, but still relatively high. In terms of his utilization, He was used 81.7% of the time in the slot in 2023 and 14.2% of the time out wide. So a little bit more outside utilization, but still in general a slot receiver. Now, looking at his yards per out run, his 3.29 were third. His PFF receiving grade of 91.0 was first. His yak per reception of 8.4 was tied for fifth. His 20 missed tackles forced was tied for 11th. His contested catch percentage, like I said, was over 50%, 56.5% to be specific, which was 13 out of 23. His 120 targets were tied for sixth. His 86 receptions were tied for eighth. His 1,209 receiving yards were fourth, and his 9 receiving touchdowns were fifth. And so I do think that the majority of the reason for the stats not looking quite as good this past season were mostly due to the offensive environment. Because in terms of his contribution to the totality of the production, it was still quite good. And so to further break down his ability to beat man and zone, as well as his abilities in the slot and on screens, I took a look at 2024 and 2023 once again to give you a better idea as to how talented he actually is, and not just things that are greatly impacted by the offensive environment, specifically this season. And so in 2024, his PFF grade versus man of 82.2 is 16th among draft eligible wide receivers, and his yards per out run versus man of 3.59 is tied for 10th. Well, when you take a look at this past season, his PFF grade versus man of 89.5 was tied for third, but his yards per out run versus man of 3.37 was tied for 12th. And so you'll notice that his yards per out run went up while his PFF grade dipped a little bit. I don't think his ability to beat man coverage and how successful he was really that much different. And so I don't really see the disparity there, other than he didn't produce the statistics that we would have liked this season in terms of counting stats. When we look at his PFF grade versus zone, his 72.9 score is tied for 54th, and his yards per out run versus zone in 2024 of 2.02 is tied for 75th. When we take a look at 2023, his PFF grade versus zone of 90.2 was first, and his yards per out run versus zone of 3.73 was second. And so you'll see a ridiculous regression there from 2023 to 2024. He didn't suddenly forget how to find the soft spots in zone coverage and sit down. It's really the offensive environment. I cannot state that enough. When we take a look at his PFF grade on screens, they were both great regardless of the season. But in 2024, his grade of 94.6 was ninth in the class. And in 2023, his 99.9 score was tied for first. Once again, he did not just magically become worse after the catch in terms of following blockers, using leverage to his advantage. That's not what happened. Offensive environment. Looking at his PFF grade in the slot this season, his 82.4 was tied for 24th. Last season, his 91.3 was tied for third. Same thing I've said over and over again. And his first downs caught this season of 29 was tied for 73rd, and his 43 last season was tied for 16th. And so while you definitely will see some regression from his some of these advanced stats and his just counting stats in general, I really don't think that he regressed that much as a player. And so moving on to his grades, remember that he's around 5'11", 208 pounds. I think both of those are reasonably accurate. He's a true junior out of Mizzou. My valuation of him, I think he's worthy of a top 15 pick. I think he's probably going to go in the 15 to 25 range. He could potentially slip into the second round, but I don't think that's going to happen. My low-end comp for him is Jaden Reed. So they're both 5'11", but Reed is about 191 pounds, and I think that Burden is going to be relatively close to 208, so he's a lot thicker. But the way I see them is that they're both best used as slot receivers. I think they both can be Z receivers. I know that Jaden Reed can, but more so I think that Burden's going to be able to as well at the NFL level. They're very good on designed touches, very good after the catch. They're basically a running back with the ball in their hands. And so I think his low-end comp is going to be Jaden Reed. Now his high-end comp, I think that he could be a less athletic Malik Neighbors and possibly limited to the slot or the Z position. And so I don't think I would have much less faith in saying that he can be an X than I did with Neighbors. And so like with Neighbors, very good after the catch, basically a running back. The burst is not quite as good as Neighbors, as well as the long speed, but it's still very, very good, especially the acceleration. And like I said, potentially a little bit more limited, but still I think he's going to be useful as a slot and probably a Z. My official grade for him is an 86 out of 100, and so that is a great receiving prospect. In terms of his route running, I give him a 4 out of 5 on short routes. I think he runs a good drag or a shallow cross. He's very good in the screen game, and he has a good hitch route. I will say, though, that the consistency on the slant routes needs some improvement. I don't think sometimes he presses the cornerback ahead of him enough, and I think sometimes he doesn't have as quick of a cut, or as sharp of a cut rather, because sometimes I think he gives away what's happening and it allows the passes to be broken up, and he doesn't create quite as much separation as he possibly could. But overall, quite effective in the short game. The majority of his production came from pop passes, screens, hitches, and the like, as well as shallow crosses. So he's absolutely, we know that he's going to be effective in the short area of the field. In terms of the medium routes, I think he has a good out route and a crosser, but I will say the cuts on the out route could be a little bit sharper. Sometimes he bends them, but the thing is, he doesn't consistently undercut the route if he's going to bend it to make sure that there's no lane for the cornerback, if that makes sense. And so I do think that he could use a lot of improvement there. And another reason I gave him a 3 out of 5 here is because we just didn't see him run some of those digs that I would prefer to see, because those are staples of the NFL offenses. And so I think he could be a lot better, but I don't know that for sure. In terms of his deep route running, he runs a pretty good post. He runs a really good slot fade. That also comes into play with my neighbors, well, less athletic neighbors comparison. And I think he runs a pretty good 9 route. He does get some separation there because he has enough burst and enough long speed to do so. In terms of the double moves, he didn't run an assortment of double moves, but he does have a really nasty out and up. And so I think that he has a ton of potential. I just don't think what Mizzou asked of him really benefited him too much there. And in terms of his releases, I give him a 3 out of 5 because I just don't know if he's going to be able to consistently utilize his hands against press coverage on the outside. And so I'm not going to give him a ding for that, but I'm also not going to give him the benefit of the doubt. I'm a lot less sure of his ability to do so than I was of Malik Neighbors, for instance. But in terms of from the slot, he has a bursty release. He uses different footwork to get it done. Not too many wasted steps during his releases. So I think they're pretty good. But once again, I do want to see him beat press coverage. In terms of his speed, I give him a 7.5 out of 10. I think he definitely has enough long speed to score from just about anywhere on the field, but I don't think he has the, Brian Thomas, Tyreek Hill burner long speed, and he doesn't have the ridiculously long strides like some of these taller guys do, but I think it's more than adequate. In terms of his acceleration, I give him a 9 out of 10. He is a very bursty accelerator. A little bit worse than Chase and Neighbors, but still a relatively comparable type of player in the slot. His deceleration, I give him a 5 out of 5. Now, the 5 out of 5 score here is his ability. He has the ability to snap down incredibly well. It's just not always consistent with him. And so with a lot of these things, he's going to just need to work on his consistency. I've seen that he is capable of doing them, and at a high level. In terms of his agility and his change of direction, he is a monster after the catch. A little bit like Jaden Reed, DJ Moore kind of a player. Very, very good. In terms of his catching traffic, run after catch, dog factor, analytics, projected draft capital, and X, Z, and slot ability, I give him a 5 out of 5 in terms of catching and catching traffic. He is dominant at the catch point. He rarely drops the ball if it's actually catchable. And I don't think there's going to be any problem there. And that's really important if he's going to work out in the slot, because there are going to be contested catches from the slot. In terms of his run after catch, he is dynamic with the ball in his hands, jukes people out, breaks tackles, has incredible contact balance, so no issues there. In terms of his dog factor, I give him a straight 5 out of 5. He's very good with the ball in his hands, breaks tackles, seeks contact, and is dominant from the slot, so no issues there. In terms of his analytics, I give him an 8 out of 10. So he had a really good freshman season, especially considering it's the SEC and he was a true freshman, and then a truly dominant sophomore season. But we did see quite a bit of regression across the board as a true junior. Once again, to contextualize that, the offense was anemic and the quarterback play was horrific. But still, we don't see the progressive increase in production from year to year like we do with most prospects. So I give him an 8 out of 10. His projected draft capital, I think he's a lock to be a first-round pick. He could slip for sure, but I think he's worthy of a top 15 pick, and I think he's going to go in that 15 to 25 range. In terms of his XZ and slot ability, I give him a 3.5 out of 5. I think he's going to be a truly dominant player from the slot. I think he's going to be an adequate to very, very good Z receiver, and I'm just completely unsure as far as being an X. And so that's a pretty decent score, but I'm just unsure of his ability to be one-on-one on the line of scrimmage as an X wide receiver. And that is my only worry. Can he consistently beat press coverage and play outside? And so where does he rank compared to the 2024 class and TET specifically? Well, Neighbors is still going to be in his own tier. MHJ is in the second tier with Burden here at the top. Then we have McMillan, Odunze, BTJ, and Burden. And so I do think that McMillan is a little bit safer in that I have no questions about his ability to play as an X or a slot. I think he'll be a decent Z, but with Burden, like I said, it's not that I think he specifically can't play as an X, for instance, against press man coverage. I don't know. And so when I don't know, I'm not going to ding you, but I'm also not going to give you the benefit of the doubt. And so I have Thomas tied with him in terms of the total score here. Thomas, I'm going to give the edge to because he for sure could be a boundary receiver. We saw it for the entirety of his collegiate career. The real question was, can he expand his route tree? The same questions apply to Burden, but more so the positional versatility, I think, is going to be a potential factor here. Like I said, I don't know, so I'm just not going to ding him, but I'm also not going to give him the benefit of the doubt. I definitely have him ahead of A.D. Mitchell, the production for the most part. McConkey, his ability to stay healthy really hurt McConkey. And I view him as a much better prospect than anybody below this. And remember that I think he's probably worthy of a top 15 pick. My low comparison was Jaden Reed. Very shifty after the catch, breaks tackles, a very good slot receiver that I think will be a Z at the NFL level for sure. And my high comp was a less athletic Neighbors and possibly limited to the slot. And so the comparison there is he has a pretty good burst. It's not that of Neighbors. His speed isn't quite as good as Neighbors either, but his yards after the catch ability is really, really good, just like with Neighbors. And he runs a really good slot fade. And I don't really have any questions about his vertical game, just like I didn't with Neighbors, especially in the slot. And so, once again, his official grade ended up being an 86 out of 100. And I want to give a special shout out to my Patreon members. Thank you to Big Hunt, SP, and Mage Jack. If you would like to join, I'm going to leave a link in the comment section. What you'll get there is private access to Discord servers, real life and fantasy football servers. In the real life, we're going to talk about real life football. I'll answer any questions you might have. Let's go over some overs and unders. In terms of the fantasy chat, I'll give you detailed team specific advice about roster construction and trades you might be able to make, along with price points to purchase and sell players for. In terms of the other benefits, you'll get shout outs on videos, early access to videos, private live streams, unlisted on YouTube to members only. And then I'll also give you the ability to suggest private videos that I'll make for you that are exclusive to Patreon. I've already done one on Isaac Garendo. And so if you would like to become a member, feel free to. Thanks.